My name is Emily Dawson. I'm in my late 30s, and for as long as I can remember, I've been described with the same words: reliable, calm, low maintenance, the kind of person managers trust with responsibility but rarely check in on, the kind of employee people assume will be fine no matter what they place on her shoulders. I've never been the loudest voice in the room. I don't dominate meetings. I don't compete for attention. I do my work thoroughly, consistently, and without spectacle. For a long time, I believed that was enough, that competence would eventually speak for itself. What I didn't understand then is that silence, when misunderstood, becomes a blank space others feel free to write over. This story isn't dramatic in the way people expect stories to be. There are no shouting matches, no explosive emails, no heroic speeches. It's quieter than that. And because of that, it's more honest. It's about how power actually shifts in real life, through decisions that seem procedural, through timing that looks accidental, through moments where no one thinks you're paying attention. The turning point came when my manager scheduled my performance review during my medical leave. No warning, no conversation, just a calendar invite sent while I was recovering, while my days revolved around doctor appointments, medication schedules, and learning how to listen to a body that had finally said enough. On the surface, it looked neutral, professional, efficient, but timing is never neutral. That single choice told me something I hadn't allowed myself to see clearly before. It told me where I stood. It told me what mattered and what didn't. It told me that my health was an inconvenience, not a consideration. And it told me that my value had a deadline, even when my body didn't have the luxury of one. This isn't a story about revenge. I didn't plot anyone's downfall. I didn't raise my voice or make threats. What I did was far quieter and far more decisive. I paid attention. I stopped explaining. I stopped assuming good intentions mattered more than consistent behavior. Over the next hour, I'll take you through what it's like to slowly realize you've been assigned a role you never agreed to play. How small dismissals add up, how being understanding becomes a trap, and how silence, once chosen intentionally, becomes a form of control rather than compliance. You'll hear about the long period where nothing outwardly changed, where I kept working, recovering, observing, and then about the moment when timing revealed priorities so clearly that denial was no longer possible. I'm sharing this not to stir anger, but to offer clarity, because many of us are taught to be patient, adaptable, grateful, even when those qualities are quietly used against us. We're told that professionalism means endurance, and that loyalty should survive any circumstance. Sometimes, though, the most professional thing you can do is notice the truth and respond without emotion. If you've ever been praised for being easy to work with while your needs were consistently postponed, if you've ever realized that your absence revealed more than your presence ever did, or if you've ever sensed that respect was conditional on your silence, then this story may resonate more deeply than you expect. Before we go any further, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever noticed that the clearest measure of how much you matter isn't what people say, but when they choose to say it? To understand what changed, you need to understand who I was to them before anything broke. At work, I was known as dependable in a way that didn't invite curiosity. I was the person projects landed on when they needed to be finished without fuss. If a deadline was unrealistic, I adjusted. If a process was unclear, I clarified it quietly and moved on. If someone else dropped a ball, it often rolled, without comment, into my hands. No one ever said this out loud, but I could feel it in how meetings flowed without me needing to be asked, how decisions assumed my availability, how last-minute requests were framed as, "You won't mind, right?" They didn't see me as someone with sharp edges or strong opinions. I was the steady background presence, useful, competent, interchangeable in their minds, even though the work I did wasn't. I didn't resent it at first. There's a certain safety in being seen as reliable. You're trusted, you're included, you're rarely challenged. I mistook that comfort for respect. When people describe me, they didn't use words like ambitious or strategic. They said things like grounded, supportive, a team player. Compliments that sound generous but never threatening. Compliments that don't suggest advancement, only endurance. I noticed that when I spoke in meetings, people listened, but they didn't always remember it was my idea later. When I raised concerns, they were acknowledged with nods, then deferred. Let's circle back. Good point, Emily. The conversation would move on, lighter, easier, as if I'd introduced an inconvenience rather than information. Still, I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I believed in proportion. I believed not every slight required correction. I believed consistency would eventually matter more than charisma. Outside of work, I carried myself the same way. I was the friend who checked in, the family member who handled logistics, the one people relied on when something needed to be organized, solved, or absorbed. I didn't ask for much. I didn't like being a burden. That pattern of being the one who adjusts followed me everywhere. At the office, my manager often praised my attitude. "You're so flexible," she'd say. "You don't make things complicated." I heard that as appreciation. I didn't yet hear the subtext: "You don't disrupt." In performance reviews, my feedback was always positive but vague. Strong execution, solid contributor, reliable presence, rarely anything about growth, trajectory, or leadership. When I asked about next steps, the answers were non-committal. "Let's see how the year goes. Right now, we just really need you where you are." Where I was, apparently, was exactly where they wanted me to stay. I didn't see myself as invisible. Not then. I thought I was simply unproblematic. I believed that being easy to work with was a virtue that would eventually be reciprocated. What I didn't realize was that invisibility doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with disrespect or hostility. It arrives wrapped in trust, praise, and assumption. It shows up when your effort is expected rather than noticed, when your absence is inconvenient, but your presence is taken for granted. No one treated me poorly outright. That's what made it hard to name. There was no single moment I could point to and say, "That was wrong." Just a slow accumulation of small decisions where my needs ranked slightly lower than the system's efficiency. I was the kind of employee managers rely on without thinking about, the kind they assume will adapt, absorb, and recover on her own time. And for a long time, I let them. Because I believed that being seen as stable meant being valued. I believed that if I kept my head down and my work excellent, the balance would even out. I didn't yet understand that when people define you only by what you provide, they stop seeing you as someone who can be depleted. That understanding came later. At this stage of the story, I was still playing the role they'd quietly written for me, not because I was weak, but because I hadn't yet questioned whether the script was negotiable. And that's what makes what happened next so important. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's how these things usually begin. Small enough to dismiss, subtle enough to explain away. I remember it clearly because of how ordinary it was. It was a scheduling change, one of those quiet calendar adjustments that arrive without context or apology. A recurring meeting I'd been part of for over a year was moved to a time I couldn't attend. No one asked if it conflicted with anything. No one followed up to loop me in later. The meeting just continued without me, and the decisions that came out of it were shared secondhand, stripped of nuance. When I mentioned it casually, not accusatory, just factual, my manager smiled and said, "Oh, I didn't think that would be an issue for you." I nodded. Of course I did. I didn't want to be difficult. I told myself it wasn't personal. Schedules change. People are busy. The work still got done. But something about phrasing stayed with me. "I didn't think that would be an issue for you." It suggested an assumption that my time was flexible by default, that my role didn't require presence to have influence, that my participation was optional rather than integral. After that, small things followed. My input was requested later rather than earlier. Drafts arrived closer to deadlines, framed as just a quick review. Projects I'd helped shape were presented upward without my name attached. Not maliciously, just efficiently. Each instance was easy to excuse. None of it rose to the level of complaint, and that was the problem. Because when something is minor enough to ignore, it's also easy for everyone else to pretend it didn't happen. Colleagues didn't notice the shift, or maybe they did, but it didn't affect them, so it didn't register. In group settings, I was still treated politely. I was still included in casual conversation. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, a pattern was forming. I started to feel like I was always catching up, not because I lacked information, but because I was being looped in after decisions had already calcified. My role subtly shifted from contributor to implementer, from voice to resource. I didn't confront it. Not yet. I told myself I was being sensitive. I reminded myself how fortunate I was to have stability, benefits, flexibility. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, and so I absorbed it. The real cut came weeks later, disguised as consideration. I'd mentioned in passing that I was dealing with some health issues. Nothing dramatic, just enough to explain why I might be slower to respond on certain days. My manager nodded sympathetically and said, "Take care of yourself. We'll adjust." I believed her. What adjust turned out to mean was that decisions were made without me rather than with me, that my reduced capacity translated to reduced relevance. That support came in the form of omission, not accommodation. No one said I was being sidelined. They didn't need to. The structure spoke for them. I remember sitting at my desk one afternoon, reading an email thread that referenced choices I hadn't known were being discussed. I wasn't copied. I wasn't consulted. I was informed after the fact of what was now expected of me. And again, I said nothing, because nothing about it was overtly wrong. There was no policy violation, no sharp comment, just a quiet recalibration of where I stood. That's the danger of the first small cut. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't demand attention. It teaches you to normalize the sensation of being slightly diminished. I told myself I was imagining things, that I should focus on recovery, that this was temporary. But my body noticed what my mind was still trying to rationalize. I felt more tired after work, not because of the workload, but because of the constant internal negotiation. The effort of staying agreeable while something fundamental felt misaligned. Everyone else moved on, as if nothing had happened. I didn't. I couldn't articulate it yet, but a quiet register in my mind had been activated. I started noticing patterns instead of moments, sequences instead of explanations. That first small cut didn't change my behavior, but it changed my awareness. And once you start seeing how easily you're excluded without resistance, you can't unsee it. After the first few moments passed without consequence, the behavior didn't escalate. It settled in. That's what made it dangerous. There was no single incident that forced a reckoning. Instead, there was repetition. The same small exclusions, the same quiet assumptions, appearing often enough that they began to feel like part of the environment rather than choices someone was making. Meetings continued to shift without consultation. Decisions were finalized before I was asked for input. When I did speak up, it was often framed as confirmation rather than contribution. "Emily, can you sanity check this?" As if my role was to validate what had already been decided, not shape it. I noticed how often my work was referenced without me being present. Slides built on frameworks I'd created. Language lifted almost verbatim from documents I'd written. My influence was still there, just detached from my name. And slowly, without realizing it, I adjusted my expectations. I stopped assuming I'd be included early. I stopped offering ideas proactively. I waited to be asked. When I wasn't, I filled the gap with execution. It felt easier than risking friction. I told myself this was professionalism, that not everything required my voice, that the work mattered more than recognition. That rationalization became my coping mechanism. Anytime a small slight surfaced, I immediately neutralized it internally. They're under pressure. It's just timing. I don't want to be perceived as sensitive. I'd absorbed the belief that maintaining harmony was more important than maintaining clarity. What I didn't see then was how quickly tolerance turns into precedent. Once people realize you won't push back on something, they stop questioning whether they should do it again. And again, and again. The tone of communication shifted subtly, too. Requests became directives. Deadlines tightened without discussion. My flexibility, once praised, became assumed. When I did express limits, they were met with surprise rather than adjustment. "Oh, I thought you'd be okay with it." That sentence came up more often than I liked. There was also an emotional layer I hadn't expected. Guilt. Anytime I considered speaking up, I felt selfish. I knew others were dealing with more visible challenges. I told myself my discomfort didn't warrant attention, so I stayed quiet. And the quiet was rewarded, not with respect, but with increased load. More responsibility without authority, more accountability without agency. I began to feel like I existed in the margins of decisions that directly affected my work and my well-being, close enough to carry the consequences, far enough to be excluded from the conversation. Still, no one would have described the environment as toxic. There was no hostility. People were friendly, polite, efficient. That politeness made it harder to name what was happening. Because when disrespect is normalized, it stops looking like disrespect. It starts looking like routine. My health issues worsened during this time. Stress has a way of surfacing in the body when it's not addressed elsewhere. I pushed through partly because I didn't want to draw attention, partly because I didn't trust that slowing down would be met with understanding. I had learned by then that accommodation often meant disappearance. So I adapted. I worked quieter. I documented more. I kept notes. not out of suspicion, but out of self-preservation. I wanted a record, if only for myself, of what was being asked, when, and under what assumptions. At the time, I didn't think of this as strategy. It felt more like grounding, a way to reassure myself that I wasn't imagining the pattern. The hardest part wasn't the extra work or the missed recognition. It was the slow erosion of my sense of legitimacy. When you're consistently treated as an afterthought, you start questioning whether you deserve more. That internal doubt is the most efficient form of control. No one had to silence me. I was doing it myself. By normalizing the disrespect, I made it invisible, even to me. I told myself this was just how organizations function, that everyone compromises, that resilience meant endurance. But endurance unchecked becomes self-abandonment. I didn't know it yet, but I was approaching a threshold. Not one marked by anger or collapse, but by clarity. Because there comes a point when the effort required to stay quiet exceeds the effort required to change. And I was getting close. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that what I was experiencing wasn't situational. It was structural. I wasn't being overlooked because of a temporary constraint or a moment of bad timing. I was being treated according to a role that had already been decided for me. I began to see it in how people spoke around me rather than to me, in how decisions were framed as fate's accomplice, in how my questions were answered with reassurance instead of substance. The message was subtle but consistent. You don't need to worry about this. Just handle your part. My part. That phrase came up often. I was the one who handled things, who filled gaps, who made sure loose ends didn't unravel. I was trusted with execution, but not with direction, with responsibility, but not with authority. The role I'd been assigned was reliable, useful, and invisible. It wasn't written into my job description, but it shaped my experience far more than any formal title. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed chaos so others could move faster. My value lay in my adaptability, not my perspective. Once I recognized that, everything else made sense. Why my ideas were welcomed only when they aligned with pre-existing plans. Why my concerns were acknowledged but rarely acted upon. Why my workload increased without corresponding influence. I hadn't been excluded accidentally, I'd been categorized. And categorization is efficient. It saves people from having to reassess you. It allows them to interact with you through expectation rather than curiosity. The unsettling part was realizing how much I'd contributed to this assignment. I'd reinforced the role by saying yes when I should have paused, by smoothing over discomfort instead of naming it, by believing that being helpful would eventually lead to being heard. I thought of all the times I'd taken on extra work without negotiation, all the times I'd stayed late without logging it, all the times I'd reassured others that things were fine when they weren't. I had trained them well. The organization didn't see me as someone who needed protection or consideration. I was seen as resilient, and resilience in institutional settings is often interpreted as inexhaustibility. When my health began to falter, that assumption didn't disappear. It was simply tested. How much could I still carry? How much would I still deliver? That's when I understood something critical. The role I occupied left no room for vulnerability. Any sign of limitation threatened the image of reliability I'd built. So when I stepped back, even slightly, the system didn't adjust to support me. It adjusted to bypass me. That wasn't personal. It was procedural. I was no longer the dependable constant. I was the variable. Once you're cast as the variable, people stop waiting for you. They move on and expect you to catch up. I didn't feel angry when I realized this. I felt oddly calm. There was relief in naming it, in understanding that this wasn't a failure on my part. It was a consequence of how I'd been positioned. Seeing the role clearly gave me distance from it. I stopped trying to exceed expectations. I met them precisely. I stopped volunteering for invisible labor. I documented what I did, not to prove my worth, but to anchor reality. Most importantly, I stopped believing that my silence was neutral. Because silence in a system like this isn't empty, it's interpreted. It confirms assumptions, it solidifies roles. And for the first time, I began to consider what would happen if I didn't play along. Not in a dramatic way, not through confrontation, but through choice. That question, quiet, persistent, marked the beginning of a shift. One that didn't announce itself outwardly, but rearranged something fundamental inside me. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't come from a conversation or a confrontation. No one said anything that day that was particularly new. What changed happened quietly. in a moment so unremarkable that no one else would have noticed it if I described it to them. I was at home, still on medical leave. The days had a different texture then, slower, quieter. Time was measured in medication intervals and short walks, not deadlines. I was supposed to be resting, but my mind was finally doing something it hadn't been able to do for a long time: process without urgency. That morning, I opened my calendar out of habit. I wasn't expecting anything. Most people had respected the boundary of my leave, at least superficially. I hadn't been checking email regularly. I was trying genuinely to heal. That's when I saw it. A performance review, scheduled neatly in the middle of my medical leave. No note, no question, no acknowledgement of the timing. Just a standard invite, slotted between meetings as if my absence were a technicality rather than a medical reality. I stared at it longer than I'd like to admit. At first, my instinct was to rationalize. Maybe it was automated. Maybe they forgot. Maybe it could be moved easily. But something about it felt deliberate, not in a malicious sense, but in a revealing one. This wasn't an oversight. It was a decision made without considering me worth the adjustment. And in that moment, something inside me went very still. I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. The timing said what words never had. It told me that my recovery was less important than maintaining a schedule, that my presence was expected even when I was officially absent, that accommodation once again meant expectation rather than care. I thought about all the flexibility I'd offered over the years, all the times I'd adjusted my life to meet organizational needs, all the patience I'd shown when plans changed around me. And here was my body, asking for rest, and the system responding with a calendar invite. I didn't decline it immediately. I didn't respond at all. Instead, I closed my laptop and sat with the feeling. It wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of emotion, just a quiet internal recalibration, like a scale finally balancing after being weighted unevenly for too long. I realized then that I had been waiting for explicit disrespect, something undeniable enough to justify action. But the truth was, I'd already been given all the information I needed. It wasn't about the review itself, it was about the assumption behind it. The belief that my time, my health, my boundaries were secondary to process. That realization didn't make me want to confront anyone. It made me want to stop participating in my own minimization. I saw clearly how this role I'd been assigned intersected with this moment. Of course, the review was scheduled during my leave. I was reliable. I was flexible. I would understand. I always had. Except this time, I didn't. I understood something else instead. Timing reveals priorities more honestly than intention ever will. In that moment, I stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. I stopped questioning my perception. I trusted what I saw. That trust changed everything. I still didn't act immediately. This wasn't a moment for reaction. It was a moment for orientation. I needed to understand the landscape fully before deciding how to move within it. But from that day on, my silence was no longer automatic. It was deliberate. I began to observe without explanation, to note without emotional commentary, to let people show me, through their choices, exactly where I stood. The shift wasn't visible from the outside. I still appeared calm, compliant, unchanged. But internally, I had crossed a line I wouldn't uncross. I had stopped waiting for permission to value myself. And once that happens, the rest is only a matter of timing. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit formed from years of smoothing things over, of choosing ease over friction. I stayed quiet because it felt polite, professional, efficient. Now silence was something I selected. When I returned from medical leave, no one mentioned the performance review scheduling. The invite had been quietly moved, as if the original timing had never existed. No apology, no explanation, just a correction without acknowledgement. That too told me something. People often assume that if they fix the surface, they don't have to address the underlying assumption. And they're usually right, because most of us accept the adjustment and move on. I did move on, just not in the way they expected. I came back measured, focused. I did exactly what my role required. No more, no less. I met deadlines. I delivered clean work. I responded on time. But I stopped volunteering my inner world. I didn't share how tired I was. I didn't explain my limits. I didn't fill silence with reassurance. When new projects were discussed without my early input, I noted it. When expectations were implied rather than stated, I asked for clarification, not emotionally, just precisely. When timelines were unrealistic, I asked for them in writing. This wasn't defiance, it was alignment. Others mistook it for passivity because I wasn't protesting. I wasn't escalating. I wasn't emotional. From the outside, I looked exactly as I always had, calm, cooperative, unproblematic. That's what made it effective. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and in that space, patterns become visible. I noticed how often decisions were made quickly when I didn't question them, how often responsibility landed with me when accountability was diffuse, how frequently my compliance smoothed over gaps in planning. I also noticed how uncomfortable some people became when I stopped anticipating needs, when I waited to be asked instead of preempting problems, when I responded to requests with neutral questions rather than immediate agreement. Nothing I did was confrontational. I was simply no longer compensating for other people's assumptions. That shift unsettled the system more than any argument would have. There's a misconception that power is loud, that influence requires assertion, but often power lies in restraint, in not rushing to fix what isn't yours to carry. I let things take slightly longer. I let questions remain unanswered until they were directed appropriately. I let managers experience the friction they'd previously outsourced to my flexibility. Still, no one called me out. They couldn't. I was doing my job. In private, I continued documenting emails, timelines, requests, decisions, not obsessively, methodically. I wanted a clean record of what was asked, when, and under what circumstances. This wasn't about preparing for conflict. It was about preparing for clarity. As weeks passed, I sensed a shift in how I was perceived, not dramatically, just a subtle recalibration. People were less casual with my time. Requests came with more context. Deadlines were discussed instead of assumed. It wasn't respect yet, but it was awareness. And awareness is often the first thing people grant you when they realize you're no longer absorbing consequences quietly. What they didn't realize was that this silence wasn't a phase. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't withdrawal. It was a boundary. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was teaching myself a new language, one where my value wasn't negotiated through endurance. The irony is that by saying less, I was finally being seen more accurately, not as endlessly flexible, but as finite, not as invisible, but as defined. And once people sense that you've defined yourself internally, they become cautious, because they can no longer rely on your silence to maintain their comfort. I didn't know yet where this would lead. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply no longer participating in my own erasure. And that choice, quiet, steady, irreversible, set everything else in motion. What they never noticed was how much space my silence created for observation. When you stop filling every gap, you start seeing where the gaps actually are. I wasn't withdrawn. I was attentive. I listened more than I spoke. I watched how decisions traveled, who initiated them, who benefited, who absorbed the fallout. I noticed which voices were deferred to automatically and which were consulted only after direction had already been set. I began to understand the organization not as a hierarchy on paper, but as a system of habits. Who emailed first? Who summarized conversations afterward? Whose version of events became the official one? Those details tell you where power actually lives. Because I'd been perceived as non-threatening for so long, people spoke freely around me. They assumed my discretion was the same as my compliance. They discussed constraints, shortcuts, internal tensions, not realizing I was mapping them. I wasn't collecting secrets, I was collecting context. At the same time, I deepened my documentation. Not out of paranoia, but out of professionalism. I saved meeting notes, I tracked changes in scope, I noted when expectations shifted without conversation. I kept copies of timelines that were later revised and presented as original. None of this felt dramatic, it felt clarifying. I also began educating myself quietly. I read policy documents I'd never needed before. I reviewed employment law, benefits language, performance evaluation criteria. I learned how accommodations were supposed to be handled, not just in theory, but in practice. The gap between policy and behavior became unmistakable. What surprised me most wasn't malice, it was convenience. The system wasn't designed to harm me. It was designed to move quickly, and I'd been convenient. My flexibility had reduced friction. My silence had preserved momentum. Once I stopped absorbing friction, the system revealed its contours. I noticed how often responsibility flowed downward while recognition flowed upward, how ambiguity protected those at the top and burdened those below, how team player was code for self-regulating. And I noticed something else too, how much institutional memory I carried. I knew why certain processes existed. I remembered past failures that current leadership wasn't aware of. I understood dependencies that weren't documented anywhere, knowledge that lived only in people, and often only in me. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel cautious. Because when you understand how much you're holding together, you also understand how fragile it is. I didn't threaten, I didn't hint, I didn't posture. I simply stopped making myself the linchpin. When asked to take on new responsibilities, I asked how they aligned with my role. When projects depended on historical context, I provided it, neutrally, concisely, without filling in every gap. I let others experience the limits of their assumptions. Still, no one noticed the preparation happening beneath the surface. Because preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like routine, like diligence, like professionalism. I was still perceived as calm, still seen as reliable, still underestimated. That underestimation gave me freedom. Freedom to think without pressure. Freedom to plan without scrutiny. Freedom to consider options without needing to justify them. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to circumstances. I was positioning myself within them. I began to imagine futures that didn't require me to shrink, scenarios where my health wasn't collateral, where my boundaries weren't negotiated after the fact. I didn't rush toward any conclusion. I let clarity arrive on its own timeline, and clarity did arrive, not as a single revelation, but as a convergence of documentation, policy understanding, institutional knowledge, and one quiet truth I could no longer ignore. The system relied on my discretion more than it respected my presence. Once I saw that clearly, I knew there was leverage. Not in a threatening sense, but in a structural one. Leverage doesn't have to be used aggressively. Often, it simply changes what you're willing to tolerate. They never noticed me preparing because they never imagined I would need to. They assumed I would continue absorbing, adapting, enduring. They didn't realize that endurance had given way to discernment, and discernment changes the rules of engagement entirely. The private reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory. It arrived quietly, like a conclusion I'd already known but hadn't yet articulated. I was reviewing my notes one evening, not with urgency, just with curiosity. Patterns tend to surface when you stop looking for them. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing, I was checking alignment. What emerged was a simple, unsettling truth. My role had expanded far beyond its formal definition, while my authority and protection had not. That imbalance wasn't accidental. Over time, I'd taken on responsibilities that crossed functional boundaries. I'd become the unofficial point of continuity between departments, the person who remembered past decisions and prevented repeat mistakes. I'd handled escalations quietly, often before they reached leadership. In doing so, I'd insulated others from risk. The reveal was realizing that this insulation worked in only one direction. When things went well, the success was diffuse. When something faltered, the accountability had a way of landing with me. And when I needed accommodation, real accommodation, the system reverted to formality, process, and silence. I compared timelines. My increased scope preceded any formal recognition. My health disclosures were followed by reduced consultation, not support. My performance metrics remained positive, even as my access to decision-making narrowed. That sequence mattered. It showed that my value was transactional, useful, but not safeguarded, appreciated, but not protected. I also realized something else, equally important. I was far more compliant with misalignment than I needed to be. There were policies in place that hadn't been offered to me, options I hadn't been told about, processes that could have supported me if they'd been activated. Not because anyone had explicitly denied them, but because no one had volunteered them, and I hadn't asked. That wasn't negligence, it was assumption. The assumption that if something mattered, someone would say so. That if support was available, it would be extended. But systems don't operate on empathy. They operate on prompts. The private reveal was understanding that I had been waiting for a system designed for efficiency to spontaneously prioritize my well-being. It never would have. Once I saw that, the emotional charge drained out of the situation. There was no betrayal to process, just misalignment to correct. I wasn't angry at my manager. I wasn't disappointed in the organization. I was clear about what it could and could not offer me, and clarity is grounding. I also understood the nature of the leverage I held. It wasn't about exposure or threat. It was about continuity, about knowledge transfer, about the invisible labor that kept operations stable. I didn't need to weaponize that knowledge. I simply needed to recognize its value and decide how much of it I was willing to continue providing under the existing terms. That decision was mine alone. I took time with it. Weeks, not days. I let the insight settle. I tested it against reality. I observed whether anything changed without my intervention. It didn't. The system continued to function, but with more friction, small delays, repeated questions, missed nuances. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to be noticeable. And still, no one connected it to me. That too was revealing. It meant my contribution had been normalized to the point of invisibility. People felt the absence of ease without knowing where it had come from. The private reveal wasn't empowering in the way people imagine empowerment. It didn't make me feel bigger. It made me feel appropriately sized. I stopped internalizing responsibility for outcomes I didn't control. I stopped compensating for gaps I hadn't created. I stopped assuming that my sacrifice would eventually be acknowledged. I also stopped explaining myself. This wasn't secrecy, it was discretion. I didn't owe anyone my internal conclusions. I owed myself alignment between what I gave and what I received. Once that alignment became non-negotiable, the path forward narrowed quickly. There were only a few options left, and one of them was irreversible. Once the private reveal settled, the noise fell away. What remained was choice. I laid out the options in front of me, as plainly as possible. Not as fantasies, but as realities with consequences. Staying exactly as I was, pushing for internal change, or stepping out of the structure entirely. Each path had costs. If I stayed without change, I knew what would happen. My health would continue to be negotiated against deadlines. My value would remain conditional on my endurance. The role I'd been assigned would solidify further until it became indistinguishable from my identity. If I pushed for change, I would need to expose the misalignment directly. Name patterns, ask for recognition and accommodation in a system that had already shown me how it handled discomfort by smoothing it over and moving on. That path wasn't wrong, but it required emotional labor I no longer wanted to perform. It required me to advocate repeatedly for things that should have been implicit, and it carried the risk of being labeled difficult, a label that often sticks more firmly than fairness. The third option, leaving, was the most final. It didn't require permission. It didn't rely on someone else's understanding. It didn't hinge on timing or approval. It was also the most frightening. I'd built a life around stability, a career that looked solid from the outside. Walking away felt like erasing proof that my effort had mattered. But that was an illusion. Effort matters when it's aligned. When it costs you your health, your clarity, your sense of self, it's no longer a virtue. I didn't decide quickly. I let myself sit with the fear. I asked hard questions. Could I afford it? Could I rebuild? Could I trust myself to choose differently next time? The answer that surprised me most was this: I wasn't afraid of failure. I was afraid of repeating the same pattern somewhere else. So the decision point wasn't just about leaving a job. It was about leaving a version of myself who believed endurance was the price of belonging. That version had carried me far, but it couldn't carry me forward. I chose the irreversible option not out of anger, but out of respect for my body, for my limits, for the truth I could no longer ignore. Choosing to leave didn't mean I acted immediately. Decisions and actions aren't the same thing. One is internal, the other is logistical. Internally, though, the choice was made. Once it was, my energy shifted. I stopped hoping things would change. I stopped scanning for signals. I stopped waiting. Instead, I began preparing, quietly. I reviewed contracts. I assessed finances. I considered timelines that wouldn't destabilize my recovery. I thought about how to exit without drama or damage to myself or anyone else. This wasn't escape. It was closure in advance. There's a moment when a decision becomes irreversible, where relief outweighs fear, not because the future is clear, but because the present is no longer a negotiation. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. I also felt something else, restraint. I didn't announce my intention. I didn't test reactions. I didn't hint. I knew that once I spoke, the system would respond in ways designed to preserve itself. So I stayed quiet. Not because I was unsure, but because I was certain. And certainty, when held calmly, doesn't need witnesses. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down, deliberately. I didn't rush toward an ending. I understood too well how systems react when they sense loss of control. I wasn't interested in provoking resistance or bargaining. I wanted a clean transition, one that protected my health and preserved my agency. So I moved in silence. Outwardly, nothing changed. I continued working. I met expectations. I remained polite, responsive, unremarkable. There was no emotional withdrawal that might signal something was coming. Internally, though, I was recalibrating everything. I organized my work with a level of precision I hadn't needed before. Documentation became structured rather than organic. Knowledge that had lived informally in my head was translated into neutral records. Not generously, not sparsely, but accurately. I didn't overdeliver. I didn't hoard information. I provided exactly what my role required. At the same time, I reviewed my finances carefully. Medical leave had already taught me the value of margin. I reduced expenses, increased liquidity, and mapped timelines that allowed for uncertainty. This wasn't fear-based planning, it was respect for reality. I also began quiet conversations outside the organization, not networking in the performative sense. No announcements, no open searches, just reconnection, listening, asking thoughtful questions, testing alignment rather than opportunity. What I noticed was how different those conversations felt. There was curiosity instead of assumption, dialogue instead of expectation. No one framed my calm as compliance. No one treated my boundaries as obstacles. That contrast was instructive. Still, I didn't act on anything immediately. I was in no hurry to trade one misalignment for another. At work, small consequences of my earlier shift continued to surface. Without my anticipatory effort, certain processes slowed. Questions that once landed with me were redirected. Decisions took longer to finalize. No one panicked, but there was friction, and friction reveals dependencies. I noticed how often people reached out with quick question messages that assumed context I no longer volunteered. I answered clearly but briefly. I asked clarifying questions. I redirected responsibility when it belonged elsewhere. Everything I did was reasonable. Nothing I did could be challenged. That's the advantage of moving in silence. You don't break rules, you simply stop bending them. Weeks passed, then months. My manager checked in occasionally, more attentively than before. I could sense a recalibration happening, but it was reactive, not reflective. Adjustments were made at the surface level: tone, frequency, small gestures of inclusion. But the structure remained unchanged. That confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't leaving because of a single person or moment. I was leaving because the system could only adjust cosmetically, not fundamentally. Eventually, the logistical pieces aligned. The timeline felt steady rather than rushed. My health stabilized. The next step, still unnamed, was viable. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt settled. When you move in silence, there's no adrenaline, no narrative arc. Just a series of quiet, disciplined choices that compound over time. And because I hadn't signaled anything, no one was prepared for what would happen next. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, in the way systems reveal strain, not through collapse, but through confusion. At first, it showed up as questions, harmless ones, clarifications that had already been addressed months earlier, requests for context that I'd once carried implicitly. People reached out expecting quick answers, and were surprised when answers took longer or required them to loop in others. Nothing was wrong exactly, things were just less smooth. Meetings stretched, decisions stalled, threads reopened, people repeated discussions without realizing they were repeating them. I noticed it because I'd been the one preventing it before. Still, no one named the shift. They couldn't pinpoint it. The organization interpreted the friction as growing pains, workload increases, temporary inefficiencies. No one thought to look at me. That invisibility, once painful, now worked in my favor. As I stepped back from being the informal connector, responsibilities redistributed evenly. Some people absorbed more, others deferred. A few became frustrated, not with any person, but with the lack of clarity they couldn't articulate. What struck me was how quickly patience thinned when comfort disappeared. The same people who had relied on my flexibility now felt the weight of ambiguity. The same processes that had functioned effortlessly now required meetings, approvals, follow-ups. I didn't point this out. I didn't correct narratives. I didn't say, "This used to be handled." I simply did my job. When my formal responsibilities were completed, I logged off. When questions fell outside my scope, I redirected them. When assumptions were made, I asked for confirmation. Each action was small, reasonable, defensible. Together, They changed the environment. My manager became more involved in details she'd once delegated. Senior leadership requested status updates more frequently. The system responded the only way it knew how, by increasing oversight. That oversight created tension. Deadlines slipped. Expectations conflicted. People became less certain about what mattered most. I watched this without satisfaction. There was no pleasure in seeing discomfort, only confirmation. The organization hadn't been resilient, it had been cushioned. And the cushion had been me. As the weeks went on, conversations shifted in tone, less casual, more urgent. My input was requested earlier again, but now with a different energy. Not collaborative, but corrective. I responded professionally, but I didn't resume my old role. That's when the consequences became personal. I sensed concern, not about me, but about continuity, about risk, about what would happen if I became unavailable again. Ironically, that concern came too late. You can't retroactively value someone's boundaries once you've built a system that depends on their absence of them. Still, no one confronted me. No one asked if I was unhappy. No one asked what I needed. They tried to fix the symptoms without addressing the cause. And the symptoms kept spreading. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't retribution. It was simply the natural result of withdrawing invisible labor. When someone stops overfunctioning, the system must either adapt or reveal its flaws. This one was revealing. I stayed calm throughout. Not because I was detached, but because I had already grieved the outcome internally. I wasn't watching something break. I was watching it return to its actual shape. The consequences had begun, not because I did something drastic, but because I stopped doing something unsustainable. And that distinction matters. The moment they realized something was wrong didn't come with an apology. It came with urgency. Suddenly, there were more meetings, more check-ins, more carefully worded messages asking how I was feeling and whether everything was manageable. The concern wasn't theatrical, but it was unmistakable. The system had begun to sense instability, and it was reaching for control. What struck me was how reactive it all felt. Questions that could have been asked months earlier were being raised now, compressed into tight timelines. Processes that had never been examined were suddenly under review. There was a flurry of activity, but no reflection. Fixing, not understanding. My manager scheduled a one-on-one with a seriousness that hadn't been present before. She spoke about alignment, about support, about how much my work was valued. The language was careful, practiced. She mentioned growth opportunities, flexibility, future planning. All the right words. What she didn't mention was timing. Not the performance review during my medical leave. Not the months of quiet exclusion. Not the assumptions that had shaped my role long before any concern was voiced. The offers on the table felt less like recognition and more like containment. I listened. I didn't interrupt, I didn't argue. I asked clarifying questions where needed. I thanked her for the conversation, and inside I knew it was already too late. Because repair requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires memory. They were trying to solve a present problem without accounting for the past that created it. The organization began making visible efforts to redistribute work, to formalize processes I'd held informally. But these efforts were rushed, lacking context, implemented by people who didn't fully understand why things had worked before. The irony was painful. I'd been asking for clarity and structure for years. Quietly, indirectly. When I needed it for survival, it was unavailable. When the system needed it for stability, it became urgent. That asymmetry told me everything I needed to know. People often believe they can fix misalignment by offering more flexibility, more praise, more opportunity, without examining why those things weren't enough before. But once trust erodes, incentives don't restore it. They just reveal what was missing all along. I could feel the panic underneath the professionalism. It showed up in follow-up emails sent too quickly, in meetings added to calendars without explanation, in the way people avoided naming the real concern, circling it instead. They weren't asking whether I felt respected. They were asking whether I would stay. And by the time that question is asked out loud, the answer is usually already formed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad. Not for myself. I was steady by then. But for how predictable it all was. How preventable. How many opportunities there had been to pause earlier, to listen, to notice the cost of convenience. I responded consistently, calmly. I continued to do my job. I didn't make promises. I didn't hint at decisions. I didn't reassure anyone. Because reassurance in this context would have been a lie. They were trying to fix something that required transformation. not adjustment. And transformation doesn't happen under pressure. It requires willingness and time. They had neither. By the time the conversations turned earnest, the groundwork for departure had already been laid, not in secret, but in silence. Too much had been revealed through timing, through absence, through reaction rather than intention. It wasn't dramatic, there was no blow-up. Just a quiet recognition on my part that the window for meaningful change had closed. Not because I refused to engage, but because I finally understood what engagement would cost. And I wasn't willing to pay that price anymore. The conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. No dramatic buildup, no tension in the air, just a calendar invite labeled check-in. By then, I understood that labels rarely reflect substance. I came prepared but not armored. There were no speeches rehearsed, no evidence laid out like a case. I wasn't there to persuade or accuse. I was there to be precise. My manager started by asking how I was doing. I answered honestly but briefly. Then she pivoted, gently, toward concerns about workload, alignment, and the future. She spoke about how much I was valued, how my contributions had been foundational, how the team wanted to make sure I felt supported. I listened without reacting. When there was a pause, I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't frame anything emotionally. I simply described what I'd observed. The timing of decisions, the absence of consultation, the performance review scheduled during my medical leave. I didn't attach adjectives to it. I didn't interpret it for her. I let the facts sit on the table, unadorned. There was a moment of silence after that, not defensive, not hostile, just still. She explained that it hadn't been intentional, that there had been pressure, that things moved quickly, that she hadn't realized how it would land. I nodded. Intent, I said calmly, wasn't what I was evaluating anymore. Impact was. I explained that I no longer felt aligned with the role as it existed, that I had taken time to consider my options carefully, that I'd come to a decision that prioritized my health and clarity. I didn't threaten, I didn't negotiate. I stated my timeline. Her reaction was restrained, professional. I could see her recalculating, not emotionally, but operationally. Questions followed. Was there anything that could change my mind? Was there a way to restructure things? Was I open to reconsidering? I answered honestly, no. Not because the offers weren't thoughtful, but because they were reactive. And I had learned, through experience, that reactive change fades once the pressure lifts. I wasn't angry with her. I told her that. I wasn't trying to make a point. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was choosing something else. There was no argument, no raised voice, just the quiet finality of a decision that had already been lived with. The meeting ended politely, cordially, almost gently. Afterward, I sat for a moment and noticed how calm my body felt. No adrenaline, no shaking, no second guessing. That's how I knew the confrontation had been complete. When you speak without heat, there's nothing for the other person to push against, no drama to deflect, no emotion to reframe, only reality. And reality doesn't need consensus to stand. After the decision was spoken out loud, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No internal collapse, no rush of grief, no surge of doubt. Life didn't immediately transform into something brighter or easier. Workdays continued, routines held, conversations stayed polite. The world didn't pause to mark the shift I'd made. And that was the point. For so long, I'd associated change with disruption, with loss, chaos, or regret. I'd believed that choosing myself would feel dramatic, or frightening, or destabilizing. Instead, it felt accurate. Who I am now isn't someone new, it's someone clarified. I'm still calm, still reflective, still someone who values cooperation and professionalism. But I no longer confuse those traits with self-erasure. I no longer believe that being easy to work with requires being endlessly available. I understand now that boundaries aren't declarations, they're behaviors. They're what you consistently choose, not what you occasionally explain. I also understand that being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it gives you time to observe, time to prepare, time to decide without interference. I don't resent my past self. She did what she knew how to do. She survived. She contributed. She kept things running. But she also learned, slowly, painfully, that endurance without reciprocity is not virtue. It's depletion. Now I move differently. I ask questions earlier. I clarify expectations explicitly. I notice timing, not just tone. I pay attention to what changes when I step back and what doesn't. Most importantly, I trust my internal signals. I don't wait for situations to become undeniable before responding. If something feels misaligned, I investigate it quietly, thoroughly. I no longer need to be the stabilizer at my own expense. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from having walked away without burning anything down, from knowing you could have stayed and chose not to. That confidence doesn't announce itself, it settles into you. People often think power looks like dominance over others. I've learned it's more often dominance over patterns, especially the ones that quietly cost you the most. I don't speak badly about where I came from. I don't rewrite the story to make anyone a villain. The truth doesn't need exaggeration. What happened happened, and I responded in a way that allowed me to keep my integrity intact. That matters to me now more than being liked or praised or perceived as indispensable, because indispensability is often a trap disguised as security. Who I am now is someone who understands that my presence is a choice, not a guarantee. That my silence means something only when I decide what it protects. I didn't win anything. I didn't prove anything. I simply stopped participating in a version of my life that required me to disappear. And that quietly changed everything. There's no dramatic ending to this story, no public reckoning, no moment where everyone suddenly understands what they lost. Life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What it does offer, if you're paying attention, is pattern recognition. The moral of this story isn't about leaving a job, or standing up to a manager, or even reclaiming power. It's about learning to read what's already being said, not in words, but in timing, in structure, in assumption. When my performance review was scheduled during my medical leave, nothing explicitly cruel happened. No one insulted me. No rule was visibly broken. But something essential was revealed. It showed me where consideration ended and convenience began. It showed me that my humanity was secondary to the calendar. And it showed me that when systems are under pressure, they default to what they truly value. That information was always available. I just hadn't been ready to accept it. We're often taught to wait for clarity to arrive loudly, through conflict, through validation, through undeniable moments. But clarity is usually quieter than that. It shows up in repetition, in what doesn't change, in how often you're asked to adapt while others are allowed to remain fixed. The danger isn't being underestimated. The danger is internalizing that underestimation and adjusting yourself accordingly. Once you do that, the system doesn't have to diminish you. You do it for them. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It wasn't bravery in the traditional sense. It was restraint. The decision to stop explaining myself to people who were already demonstrating what they were willing to hear. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't leave to make a statement. I left because staying would have required me to keep translating misalignment into tolerance, and that translation was costing me too much. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Pay attention to how people handle your limits, especially when those limits inconvenience them. That's where truth lives. You don't need permission to believe what you observe. You don't need consensus to respond to it. And you don't need to justify choosing yourself once you've seen the pattern clearly. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about refusing to lose yourself in order to maintain someone else's comfort. Thank you for listening to this story, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's common and often unspoken. Before we end, I want to ask you one open question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where timing, not words, revealed exactly where you stood, and what did you choose to do after you saw it?